Welcome, everyone. This is a technical lunch and learn meeting sponsored by the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, Los Angeles section. And today we will be dealing with a presentation by Jacob Sørendergaard on the vehicle concept, internal acoustics zone concepts. But first we have a few issues to take care of in terms of the support of the organization and the location here. So we're located at the Lawndale Library, public Los Angeles County Library, and we're using their facilities. If you brought your lunch, you're welcome to enjoy that while we have the presentation. If not, that's just fine. Do bus anything that you bring in if you do that. The LA section puts on a series of technical events, and I don't have a list of those right now, but if you're on this distribution, you should be able to check those out as well. Okay, so let's go. Should we just proceed to the introduction to the speaker? Okay, so Jacob Sørendergaard is a acoustics representative in the area of customer satisfaction or travel transportation acoustics. I should have practiced this thing.
That's all right.
Anyway.
You're good. Yeah, all good.
His background is support of test and measurement equipment, but now he's working in the customer satisfaction and supporting the analytical and equipment development as well. His primary interest is improving the sound quality in transportation vehicles. The difficulty being, of course, that external noises and internal, in aircraft particularly, can be very distracting from any other events, and technically the solutions can be done either by improving the physics of the vehicle and adding weight to reduce the structural transmission of noise, or you can do zone concepts, which is improving the sound quality in the vicinity of the passengers, and that's what we're talking about today. He started out, his inspiration was really about his grandfather, who formed Grass Acoustics in Denmark, and he actually supported his grandfather's business during his childhood and his high school and college area. So he got a very good grounding in the acoustics area. He went on to study acoustics at the Imperial College in England and got his master's degree from the University of Sussex. So with that, let's introduce Jacob, and you can carry it on for the presentation here today.
You got it. Thank you, Gary. So the first thing I want to make sure is that you guys can hear me online, and you can hear me in the Lawndale Library. So Ken, can you just confirm?
Yes, can you get me?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. And for those online, I think you can use like the Q&A feature just to submit something. Ken should be able to see it. I hope you can hear me. I hope you can see me. I am calling you from the greater Cleveland, Ohio area in the middle of a snowstorm. So, I hope transmission is okay. And the funny thing about Ohio and aerospace is I once read a fact that upwards of half of all astronauts came from Ohio at some point in time. And it always makes me chuckle because the joke about Ohio is people can't wait to get out of it and go somewhere sunny and warm. And in fact, these people went to such great lengths, they went to space to get out of Ohio. That being said, I love it here. It's a great place. Come visit, say hi if you're ever in the Cleveland area. I'll be happy to show you guys around. But I was invited here today to give a presentation on something that I think is a little bit unique to what you guys are doing within the greater framework of engineering and aerospace. And my goal is to present something that's a little bit interesting, that stimulates some good thought and discussion, and it all relates to zone concepts inside of a craft. So I'll set the stage real quick, set some foundation, and then I'll get into what we mean when we're talking about voice and noise, how the two interact. I'll talk about the acoustic zones and get into privacy, acoustic privacy, and we'll wrap this thing up. And if we have time, we'll do some Q&A afterwards. So first question is, does audio fly? In fact, it does. But what I want to illustrate here is that there's a lot of audio technology that goes into aerospace. Sort of the main head unit, the controller, brings together a lot of audio and communication features from the entire vehicle. It's the heart, mind, and soul of a modern aircraft. And for something a little bit more forward thinking, specifically when we start talking about eVTOL, which is sort of the concept I'm going to wrap this around, because there's a lot of development in this space right now, then I want you to think about all these audio features as something akin to like a vehicle cabin. There's audio playback, there's hands-free communication, so making phone calls. You might also have speech recognition features like, adjusting temperature controls or other more critical features from a pilot perspective. But all of these features roll in and create a user experience, and hopefully a positive user experience. Out of all these things, I will focus on active sound design and sort of the in-cabin communication system and the in-cabin communication features. ANC is also an important one. It's not really within the scope of this presentation today. Gary touched on it lightly. When you go flying, you want to conserve weight, especially in these electric VTOL vehicles. Weight is a huge thing. And so I can't stress enough how important active components are going to be, digital components. We'll talk on about active sound design and the in-cabin experience. We will ground that in what we call a listening effort metric that we're going to be using to evaluate our system performances. So listening effort is a metric that's internationally standardized. It's a little bit akin to speech intelligibility, but it is modern. It's a binaural metric, and it just performs a lot better than the intelligibility metrics from back in the 60s and 70s. So when we talk about active sound design, the general concept is you might have an aircraft that has a bunch of passengers. Generally, the eVTOL market tends to be much smaller, so something like 6 seats would be typical. We have our pilot up front and then 4 passengers in the rear of the craft. And active sound design comes in by taking data from sensors around the vehicle. So these could be microphones, or they could be accelerometers, so they're sensing vibration, gyroscopes, etc., pressure sensors. But all this sensor data we will capture, we will feed that into the head unit such that the sound signature in the back, this looks like, a takeoff profile. So you're looking at the spectrogram versus time. So time is on the x-axis, frequency is on the y-axis, and then the amplitude is the color scale. Like the hotter the color, yellowish, the louder it is. We're looking at this profile, consider it a little bit like a ramp up. You're starting to fire up the rotors and it's making more and more noise, but it doesn't necessarily sound great. So we're using the data information to create what we call an ASD, an active sound design contribution, that we then play out of the loudspeakers in the cabin, so that now the profile, the sound signature of the aircraft sounds different. It sounds more pleasing. It sounds more powerful, maybe a little bit less fragile. You certainly don't want an aircraft to sound fragile. So there's a bunch of reasons why you would be considering active sound design. But this is the general concept of using the information available to us and then digitally creating something artificial. And the term artificial sort of has two meanings. Artificial as in fake. That's not a good thing. Artificial is also to be interpreted as this, creative, positive, additive component that we're adding to the sound field. It's artificial, but it sounds great. That's kind of the goal with active sound design. For the in-cabin communication system, if we take a slightly different layout, we again have a 6-seater craft, but we now have 2 people facing to the rear and the 2 people in the back are facing forward. So it's sort of like a conference room setup. And you might have people communicating and talking in the back, conducting a business meeting, let's say. And the idea is that not only do we want the communication to flow freely between the passengers in the rear, but occasionally we'll want the pilot to be involved in that communication. And so when they talk, their speech is generally directed straight forward because that's where their attention is. It's on the flight controls. It's on what's ahead of them as they're navigating the craft. And very little of that speech gets reflected back to the rear seat passengers. So the intelligibility is very, very low in the rear of the craft. In-cabin communication systems will use some sophisticated processing. So the microphone signal by the pilot, we can apply some noise reduction and what we call automatic gain control, AGC, and echo cancellation and some equalization, and feed it out of the loudspeakers in the back so that the pilot can be involved in the conversation in the back without having to strain their voice when they're talking or having to yell. So this is assuming a future state where an eVTOL craft is going to be relatively quiet and be conducive for hosting meetings. And I think we're getting awfully close to that scenario. The last bit of groundwork that I wanted to cover is this listening effort metric. It is officially standardized in ETSI TS 103558. This is a publicly available standard. Anyone is available to go and access it and download it if you want to get deep into the math. Suffice it to say, it is a MOS metric, MOS meaning mean opinion score. So think of inviting 300 of your best friends into a room and asking them to evaluate a sound or some speech in noise, and they give an opinion score on integer level 1 to 5. 1 is the worst and 5 is the best. Once we collect all that data from all these people, we can create an algorithm that simulates that pool of people so that every time you run the algorithm electrically or digitally on a recorded signal, it's just like inviting those 300 people back into the room and asking them, well, what do you think about this signal? Or what do you think about that signal? And because we now have an algorithm, we can take the mean of all the opinion scores. And so we can actually get more than just integer values. We do get a much greater resolution. But still, the overall concept is maintained that 1 is the worst and 5 is the best. To add the subjective qualifiers, you would say that a score of 1.0 means that just absolutely no amount of effort is going to make it possible to understand what's being said. And all the way at the top, you have 5, which means you can, in a completely relaxed state, understand what the person is saying to you. Some of the things here that maybe are worth mentioning is that compared to metrics of yesteryear, like speech intelligibility index, the listening effort covers a much wider SNR range, and we can look at other attributes while we're looking at this. So it's a pretty powerful metric. So with those three concepts as our foundation, I would like to go into how we combine voice and noise, and specifically this element of designing noise. First thing is, why do we need active sound design? Active sound design, unlike passive sound design, is working in addition to the sounds that already exist. So Gary talked a little bit about passive sound design. So that is using the mechanical structures and the noise sources themselves to change how they behave. Typically, a lot of that involves adding weight, especially when we talk about dampening the acoustics, dampening the noise sources. It's about weight. Anything from added masses to masking tape to other type of rigid, to make structures more rigid or flexible. All those things come with a weight penalty. So active is then using the audio system and the onboard sensors, both the microphones for the input and the loudspeakers for the output, to create a more pleasing sound signature. So think about a typical eVTOL. There are a lot of noise sources because they tend to have a lot more rotors or propellers, whatever shape or configuration they're in. There are a lot of them, and especially in the hover or landing mode, the automatic propulsion motor control systems dynamically, but also interdependently and individually per motor slash propeller modulate the motor speeds to manage the flight and the air conditions. So there's a lot of things going on, and this will inevitably create blade pass tonalities that are detectable and perceptually inside the cabin. But this perceptually random interpropeller speed variations, which managed by the flight control computer, would produce randomly shifting modulations of a family of tonalities of nearly but not exactly the same pitch because of the way the hovering mechanism is working. So one of two things could happen. This could produce a very subtle sort of a swarm of bees effect that would organicize, don't know if that's a word, we're going to go with it, but it would organicize the sound and make it a lot more interesting and less toxic to the human ear. Or it could be terribly grating or irritating, and maybe worse, invoke a sensation of something malfunctioning. That's not good. That's not what you want your passengers or your pilot to be experiencing and hearing while you're flying. So bottom line is, in music, in nature, in real systems and real spaces, acoustics and audio is very complex. And the challenge that we're faced with is, how do we achieve a positive and pleasing complexity when we're dealing with these electronic strategies of active sound design and the sort of virtual space of a aircraft cabin. So if we take a look at the NVH properties, noise, vibration, harshness properties, there are a couple noise sources that I would point to right away. Number one is from the pure EV powertrain situation. We have a lot of electric motors and transmissions, maybe some frequency inverters and auxiliary components that generally create sort of a whirring sensation. If anyone's been in an electric car, it sounds a lot like that. Of course, we also have wind noise, just pure wind, but also aerodynamic noise when we're actually traveling and going through the air. And then one of the more dominant ones, once we're actually up in the air and we're going, is of course the propeller slash rotor noise. And a lot of that depends on the geometry and how many blades per rotor and their spacing and this blade pass frequency and the tonality that occurs from that. The bottom line is, when you are in one of these eVTOL, there's a lot of different noise sources that are impacting on the cabin space, and you would want it to be as pleasing as possible. We would like to get the physics right first, always. So we do what we can with passive attenuation methods to try to attenuate and modulate the sound signatures to make it as quiet and as pleasing as possible. That's step number one. But step number two is we have to engage with some active sound design concepts. And speaking of, here's an example of this active sound design concept. In a world where I was not presenting this digitally, I would be able to play you the sounds here, but I'm afraid that Zoom, the noise suppression, is going to work against me. And since I'm playing mostly noise, it's going to suppress it. We won't hear much. So I'll skip it, but I will share the content afterwards and you guys can take a listen afterwards. So this is essentially the equivalent of a ramp up of an electric motor system. So you start to hear that whirring sound. Again, we're looking at a spectrogram. So the x-axis is going to be time, and the y-axis is going to be frequency. So everything down here is lower frequency noises. Everything up at the top, which is relatively dark, is high frequency. So there's not much happening above 5 kilohertz. As you know, the human ear goes from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz on a good day, but this is definitely within the audible spectrum, everything you see here. And then as we start to ramp up over time here, the 16 seconds or so, towards the end, you can see it starts to get a little louder. When you listen to this, it sounds rather tame and dull and doesn't really inspire a lot of confidence in what the motors are supposed to be doing, which is instilling thrust or power. And so by strategically adding ASD, so that's really the ASD component on the right-hand side here, it consists of some what we call shepherd tones, lower frequency shepherd tones that is supposed to invoke that feeling of power and substance. And then also a 20th order dominant tone, sort of like masking a little bit that EV whine noise. So when somebody activates the throttle, instead you end up with this kind of sound signature here, very different than the one below, and combined, it just sounds so much nicer. That's fantastic, because then people in the cabin will then experience something that sounds like there's confidence in the rotor systems and the motors and the electric vehicles. The problem is that not every seat location in a typical craft is going to receive the same amount of active sound design contribution because the speakers aren't dedicated for each seat location. In this very simple drawing of my craft, you can see I have 4 loudspeakers. They're really dedicated towards the rear of the craft instead of the front. And so what is very typical is that certain seat locations get a much stronger component for the active sound design. If you're going so far as to, put in subwoofers as well for a lot of that low frequency content, then they typically are also stored in the rear of the craft. And so it makes sense that the rear passengers would get more ASD content. But if you are in the process of implementing active sound design, you also have to think, who's it designed for? In an aircraft or in an eVTOL, who's the primary recipient? Who is it that this should sound pleasing to? Is it the pilot, who's up front, or is it the passengers in the back? Basically, you want to ensure that you don't have this uneven ASD distribution, the active sound design, at each seat location. Now, the things that I want to share with you that we're then testing is the different communication scenarios. So the first one is when the active sound design, when it is active sound design, when it is applied, how easy is it for our pilot in the front seat to communicate with other passengers in the craft. So we'll use the listening effort metric to determine a couple different scenarios of what that could look like and what the experience is for the passengers in especially the rear seat. The other communication scenario that we'll talk about is how the in-cabin sound design affects the conversational experience and potentially privacy. So in this case, let's assume that the pilot is going to be engaging in a hands-free call because they should have their hands on what looks like a Super Nintendo controller, but on the flight control system and not activating other communication methods. They're using the hands-free system in the craft to communicate, but are they able to communicate safely and privately within this craft? Again, we'll use the listening effort metric to evaluate what the other seat locations are going to be hearing when the pilot is in communication. So we're actually using the listening effort metric in reverse. We're actually looking for the lowest possible listening effort score in this case, because we want privacy. We want it to be hard to hear what's going on at the pilot seat location. So let's dive in and look at what this in-cabin communication is going to look like. Number one, a little bit of a bait and switch time for me, because due to all the development that's taking place in eVTOL right now, there is a ton of privacy and confidentiality and competitiveness around what's happening with those crafts. So any data that I may or may not have specifically related to eVTOL, I am not able to share in this format. And instead, I need to draw a corollary with electric cars, and use data from an electric car. So I apologize. The concept is exactly the same, and I'm going to show you some scenarios that apply directly to an eVTOL. Just know that the data originates from an electric car and not from an electric VTOL. Now, first thing is we want to go back to our listening effort metric. Keep in mind these subjective qualifiers for each category, and just keep in mind 1 is the worst and 5 is the best. So the two conditions we want to look at is, number one, a steady state condition. So you could consider this a hovering scenario in an eVTOL or just a cruising scenario. What we're capturing is the operating condition of an electric vehicle at about 40 miles an hour or 60 kilometers an hour. What I am showing you on this graph is a level versus time graph. The level in dB SPL, so sound pressure level, is shown on the y-axis, and then time is on the x-axis. The blue curve tells us what the level is when the active sound design is off, and the orange curve shows us what the level is when the active sound design is on. So for a very steady state operating condition, the active sound design is not that pronounced. It's only producing about 2 dB more of sound in the cabin. However, for the speed, like the ramp up, ramp down scenario on the right-hand side, so that is accelerating from about 35 miles an hour to 60 miles an hour, and then coasting back down to from 60 back to 35. You can see that the active sound design component contributes a lot more sound / noise to the vehicle exterior. So for the ramp up, ramp down type scenario, think of takeoff, landing, or just changing altitude during flight. You're actively doing something to modulate the rotors or the propellers. Now, what we do is we strategically insert some speech samples, some known speech samples. And in the voice and telecommunications and intelligibility space, we quite often use what's called Harvard sentences. Harvard sentences, they get that nickname, I think, because somebody at Harvard a long time ago actually wrote out what these sentences were supposed to look like. Basically, they are phonetically balanced sentences that stress all the phonemes and sibilances of the language that we're using. It's a mix of male and female speech, and so you get the higher frequency and the lower frequency and the different expressions within the language. And these are all open source recordings that you can download from ITU-T P501, an international standard, and they have languages. They have English, French, German, Spanish, Chinese Mandarin. They have all kinds of languages. We happen to use English for this, but we insert some of these speech samples at strategically important points within our noise signatures, both for the constant noise as well as for the modulating noise. And then we go to measure our listening effort at each of the seat locations. So for the first condition, at a constant speed and our pilot or driver talking directly forwards, what we end up with is listening effort scores that are all the way up to a 4.0. So remember, that's very good. Very little efforts required to understand the driver, to about a 2.8 or 2.9. So we're somewhere down around average. You know, there's a moderate amount of effort required, but you can understand what's going on, what's coming out of the driver's mouth, essentially. It's not that difficult. With ASD on and off, so again, sticking to the blue and the orange color combo, the ASD does not actually contribute a whole lot of degradation for that scenario. Now, for the next one, let's see if we can get to the next one. Here we go. We have the speed, the ramp up and ramp down scenario. And we can see that in this case, because of the added active sound design component, now we're starting to see significant drops for this rear seat. This is for one particular vehicle. This is for a scenario where the active sound design was primarily dominated by the rear loudspeakers in the vehicle. And so this is where we get an uneven ASD contribution at each seat location. That is unfortunate because it punishes the driver's side rear seat passenger quite significantly. So half a MOS point drop in listening effort is significant and makes it difficult, especially now we're down at a 2.4. Makes it very difficult to understand what's going on from the rear seat. Now, we can simulate user behavior and rotate the head 90 degrees. It's not a desired outcome, but frankly, you've seen it, maybe done it. If you're talking to somebody in the back seat and you're driving, flying, you might be turning your head, and that does help with the listening effort scores in the two sort of adjacent seat locations, but still the seat location behind the driver doesn't get much benefit at all, especially when the active sound design is on. So that is a bit of a problem. It may sound better. Everyone might agree that the car, or in this case, the craft, might sound stronger and more dominant and better, but you need to consider what that does for the communication effort in the cabin. How easy is it for everyone to communicate? And an eVTOL is going to be a little bit louder than an electric vehicle in these situations. So if you are involved in that space, if you are designing out cabins, if you are working with this type of technology, yes, you want it to sound comforting and strong and powerful, but you also want to consider how conducive is it going to be for communication within the cabin, especially for, let's say, a front row type passenger that may or may not have to rotate their head around. So this is something that applies for high-end aircrafts, eVTOLs, air taxis, etc. So let's switch gears and then let's look at the human-to-human interaction, but through a communication device. So this is a little bit like that hands-free scenario. I'm going to draw parallels to the car industry because I have data that I can actually share with you. if you're driving a vehicle that was released in, let's say, 2010 or newer, chances are you have a hands-free system in your car that involves a single microphone located somewhere in the front, and then the hands-free system would typically only use front two speakers, or if it's a two-way or a three-way system, the front speakers in the A pillar, for instance, to produce the speech in the front. Newer vehicles, you have more microphones. You might have microphones for the driver and for the co-driver, and it certainly would use more loudspeakers. But in general, what we end up with is a very symmetrical representation of the sound coming from what we would call the far end. So the person on the other end of the system. That means if we're looking at the two seat locations in the front, the average speech level at each of these guys' ears in the front is going to be more or less the same. It's the same sound coming out of both sets of loudspeakers. They're represented by exactly the same. Now, here's where we're starting to take these next steps into zone concepts, and it will make things a lot more interesting, because if we just experiment and take off-the-shelf loudspeakers and we mount them to the headrest so that the driver only is receiving the speech, we can tune those loudspeakers for the driver to present exactly the same response when they are in a phone call. But what happens to the co-driver position is now all of a sudden they have an awfully hard time hearing what's going on in the driver's seat, because the driver has this private communication system right next to their ears. Right off the bat, what we see is an attenuation of about 9 dB. So between the driver location and the co-driver location, and they are not seated very far apart, there's a 9 dB drop. In practical terms, what that means is that the listening effort at idle in an electric car, so there's absolutely no noise around, nothing's really going on, the listening effort for the driver is going to be 4.6. So very loud, almost the loudest, the perfect listening effort score you can get. And the co-driver is already at a 3.4, meaning with some moderate effort, they can still understand what's going on. And this is in complete silence. Now, if we did the without the headrest, just for reference, and we just looked at when we used the door speakers, we got a 4.4, which is good, but not as good as a 4.6. So now what happens is when we start to move this vehicle, we're seeing the additional masking noise of the car itself, the electric engines, the road noise, the wind noise, etc. All these noise components are contributing, as well as the active sound design in the vehicle, such that while the listening effort does drop for the driver position to a 3.1 and a 3.3, so some moderate efforts required even for the driver, it is now virtually impossible for the co-driver position to understand what's going on in the driver's seat location. And so in the event you're having a conversation with a business partner, a doctor, your bank, there might be key information that you don't necessarily want transmitted. And it is now possible to do that with the appropriate noise signatures from a moving vehicle by using these headrest mounted speakers. And this is a very rough example of what that could look like. So it's a powerful technology that's going to play an important role in the future of audio systems in vehicles and aircrafts, because what this presentation is not doing is it's not touching on active noise cancellation, but this obviously holds a lot of potential for creating a little bubble that reduces the noise at your seat location. I don't want to go into too many details on that, but if we start to think ahead, what if each seat location now had a set of headrest speakers? And think about the evolution in these speakers. We just use bog standard commercial off-the-shelf products, but there are dedicated loudspeaker arrays and playback solutions that are constantly being involved that holds a lot of potential. Because think about what the active noise cancellation could be at the noise of each ear location in the aircraft. This goes back to that weight argument and, making the cabin experience a lot more pleasing. But think also what it could do for the in-cabin communication if each seat location had individualized and personalized loudspeaker systems. There's a lot more that can be done there. And then here's another fun one, because think what strategically adding more active sound design could do for privacy. Not just in terms of the receive direction, but also for when you are talking, because that is a tricky subject that has not been solved at this time. So with that, I sort of want to wrap up here and say these acoustic zones and bubbles, we are just getting started with this technology. And with the sort of lifespan and the development cycles of commercial airliners, that's something that is still really waiting to be adopted. But eVTOL is a market in crazy development right now, as is automotive and train cabins for that matter too. So there's a lot of potential here for what this technology could do. And this was just meant to be a little sampler to stimulate some thought and some good discussion about considering audio and acoustics in your development plans. I touched a little bit on, what passive and active sound design are, and really, this is daily engineering stuff. There's a lot of people engaged with it. The company I work for, Head Acoustics, we do a lot of this type of work as well. And with all things sound, it's funny, we quite often run into situations where the team that is in charge of doing the sound design of the vehicle is not the same team that's in charge of the telematics or the telecommunications of the vehicle or the craft. And so you have two teams that are not really competing, but they don't have exactly the same goal, even though they both work with audio and acoustics. And one of the goals with this presentation is highlighting this issue of, if you are designing sound, make sure you take into account the communication that is supposed to take place in the presence of that sound. And then lastly, as I touched on, loudspeakers and playback solutions are constantly evolving. There's a lot of stuff going on. And frankly, if you are involved with audio and acoustic engineering, it's an exciting time to be alive. There's still a lot of stuff happening in a lot of different industries. So I hope I inspired some people to take a closer look. And if you're not in audio and acoustics, talk to your audio and acoustic engineer. I'm sure they will have a lot of things to say regarding this. So with that, that is the end of my presentation. And I've been on some of these lunch and learn things before. Rarely is my lunch break long enough to get through all of these sessions, but I hope that you guys are able to make it onto your next meeting and appreciate maybe a little bit of time to gather yourselves before your next stop.
Brian was a manager. Scott, Steve, and Ed. And Bill.
Okay, we have a few questions that are waiting in the wings here. Let's, which one's the oldest one?
Scott.
So let's start with Scott. Scott.
Sure.
Sir.
Hi, I was curious about the unintended consequences of changing the sound in the aircraft cabin. A pilot listens to the aircraft and hears when things are going wrong, if the engine's out of whack, or in the case of an eVTOL, I imagine bearings, or if the beat was different than he expected, he may not be able to hear it because of the good sound that's there. and or the conversation in the back may create a tonalities that he hears in a different spot in the aircraft, such that he thinks that that is something that shouldn't be happening. Over.
That's a great comment. I can frame my answer in a bunch of different ways, but you know, out of all the engineering dollars that get spent in aerospace, you know, this much of it is allocated to audio and acoustics. And, you know, to a certain extent, I'm a little upset about that. I wish more was spent in audio and acoustics. But at the same time, I understand that the number one thing is flight worthiness and, you know, and range and getting to your destination safely and all that stuff. So, that being said, to address your question, yes, if there is an actual pilot who is flying the craft or navigating the craft, audio clues, contextual clues that are delivered through audio is hugely important in the event of emergencies or potential emergencies. And that's not something that you should take lightly and just overrule using something like active sound design. That being said, I also know of these eVTOL companies that are producing crafts that don't have a pilot. You just go in and, you know, autonomously, it'll take you from point A to point B, and you just have to enjoy the ride. And that's a slightly different scenario. So, you know, use with caution and use where appropriate, because you know, I work in audio and I've done so for basically my entire life. And sometimes it's a bit of a curse because no matter where you go, you can't help but pay attention to the audio clues around you, whether it's the button on a microwave or, you know, the rear wheel bearing on your car. And all these little noises tell you something about the product. And same thing holds true for an aircraft. So a good question. And unfortunately, my answer is a little bit, it depends, you know.
Jacob, I think it's also important. Hi, by the way. I don't know if you knew I was on here or not.
Hey, Brian. No.
But I also answered their question. I also told them because we look at broadband noise when we're talking about the ASD and the ANC stuff. We're looking at broadband noise, the transient events or the uncharacteristic events. We're not looking for those when we're developing these filters and the curves for the in-cabin speech and qualities. So the unexpected or unanticipated noises, i.e., mechanical failure modes, um, we have the benefit of those are still audible because they're still going to be heard unless they're masked by the other noise, which you wouldn't hear them anyway. Also with the eVTOL companies, because there are multiple motors and designs in their different structures, they typically have a percentage. Right now, the companies that we talk to is about 20% of the motor can fail and still remain in flight and have a safe landing under those conditions. So although we do mask some of it, we don't have to cover all of it because the damaged or the failure parts will still hear it.
Hey, Jacob, can you hear me?
Yes, who's talking though?
Yeah, this is Steve Stirk. I'm
Hey, Steve.
AIAA member from Antelope Valley section, but I work for NASA Armstrong Flight Research Center. So my question is, sometimes it's all about risks, but where does acoustics line up on the risk chart for the overall risk metric for the entire eVTOL system? So I'm thinking the batteries have to be pretty high. I'm thinking the bearings on the electric motors could be pretty high. I'm thinking acoustics would end up number 3. I don't know. I just wanted to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so this is what I alluded to a little bit when I was answering Scott. It's unfortunately acoustics a little bit lower on the totem pole, but from a user experience perspective, and you might think about this when you're dealing with general household appliances or white goods or cars or anything that sort of makes a noise, uh, subtly and subconsciously, the audio does play a very large component in the overall satisfaction of and appreciation of that product. So the user experience perspective is high. And this is where I got into, well, user experience in aerospace typically starts with surviving the trip, number one. and getting to your destination number 2. And then at that point, you can start to consider what is the interior cabin experience. And that's where audio and acoustics should play, in my opinion, a slightly higher part.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, so yeah, great presentation. So
Thank you.
the Air Acoustics Committee and the AIAA concerns itself with sonic booms.
This sounds like Karen.
What was that?
Would you identify yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry, Kevin Burns.
Right.
And so where would this type of technology fall into the disciplines? Would this be like aircraft design or?
Yeah, I mean, this typically happens more on the design phase than anything else. So it's part of the engineering team in the design phase of the craft. And the engineering team can do some things, as I talked about, passively, but they have to be very mindful of the weight penalty. And there are methods and remedies that can be implemented actively. And that's really what I want to emphasize, because the active component is something that can be added relatively late in the game after the craft has sort of been designed, which gives us an opportunity to improve the user experience even that late in the game, which is positive.
So the other thing is, in the late 80s, early 90s, I was working for CalSpan, and we got tasked by our parent company, Arvin Industries, to develop an electronic muffler. And as we talked to people at for example, the Recreational Vehicle Industries Association, they're very interested in being able to use something like that for generators and air conditionings and like that inside the RVs. And Onan, who builds large compressors and generators, was interested. For example, you've got a telephone team that's working in a manhole, and they got the compressor running, and there's a lot of people crossing the street, and they're getting a lot of noise. It would be great if they could cancel some of that out. The problem we had is there was no speaker systems that could be used. It could take that type of a beating. Has technology changed since then, or is there something that would actually survive something like that?
Well, specifically where I'm seeing the potential is in things like headrest mounted speakers. So you're inside of the cabin, you're in a controlled environment in terms of temperature, humidity, pressure, and you're using them in a very close proximity to the ears. So it's still an incredible challenge to provide uniform noise cancellation over a large space or a large chamber, as it were. And instead, if you can take advantage of the technology to create these little bubbles, zones, and do something very close to the ears, that's where I see a lot of potential for actually implementing very positive and dramatic change in what the noise exposure is for the pilot/passengers on board, especially eVTOL. But these smaller craft, high-end jets, I would put into that same category. So I don't think like durability and robustness is a huge deal for those types of applications because of the environment.
All right. Well, thank you very much. A really excellent presentation.
Sure. Thank you.
Jacob, real quick too. This is Brian again. For Kevin's question about the exhaust. So Head Acoustics in Germany and partly here in the US, we did work with a company called Jekyll and Hyde, where they did electric damper on motorcycle, like Harley style exhaust systems to eliminate the exhaust noise. And what they called it was the good neighbor mode, that allowed for the motorcycle to operate under normals of the exhaust system. So it actually worked out pretty well in that case as well. So between the 80s and now, there has been a few advancements, not many in the exhaust world, but it has been pretty cool.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, if anybody else has any questions, please either preferentially start with a chat, and send a chat message out. We can try to reply to those questions. We'll invite you in to format the question. But I think at the moment we've gone through the messages that were in the chat box. Is anybody there that wants to add anything from that? Okay.
Ronald might have a question. Have something, but
Ronald Clyburn, do you have a question that you were formulating? Well, at the moment, let me go ahead and do something else. By way of the ability of the human ear to perceive noise and harshness, it's very interesting to know that with the Fourier transform theory, it takes an acoustic perception of twice the frequency to recognize the difference between sines, square waves, and sawtooth waves. Does your system recognize the different characteristics of the particular frequencies, or is that
the system themselves? Yes, that can be measured and perceived. You know, a lot of what we do is focused on the user experience, so we tend to rely on binaural recordings using these head and torso simulators when we're doing measurements. There's a stick microphones serve a purpose, but if you're talking about user experience, there's no replicating the sound field experience you're able to capture using a binaural setup. So we tend to use binaural heads. That being said, when it comes to the analysis, we can measure anything that comes in the ear, and how we perform sort of the reasoning or the analysis on those measured signals boils down to the tools available to us, and that's everything from simple level and spectrograms and FFTs to look at the content to more sophisticated models that replicate the behavior of the human ear. So the head and torso is just a physical representation of the human. Another thing is the psychoacoustics, the link between the physics of the eardrum and the impression that's, you know, invoked, the emotion. That's where psychoacoustics comes into play. And there are very sophisticated hearing models that can be applied to look at things like how obnoxious certain sounds are, how noticeable certain sounds are versus other sounds. And those are the types of models that we are playing with and using strategically to design the most optimal sound signature. So when we're doing these active sound design exercises, we're using those models aggressively to make sure that we end up with the most pleasing sound. So it can get quite gnarly, to use a technical term.
Yeah, and like in propeller passage, that's the periodic event, and so there's a rapid change in the frequency content and the signal as the blade passage goes from close to far and so forth, and the interference between adjacent blades. Are you looking at the periodic nature there to try to anticipate some of the signals that you may be getting?
Absolutely. But a lot of that, you know, that's physics and mechanical engineering, and some of it can be remedied through those mechanical engineering exercises, through design early on. But if you can't, then you're gonna have to do the best you can using active sound design methods.
Okay, we have a question here from the audience.
Yep.
Introduce yourself, please.
Hello, my name is Layla, and firstly, I wanted to thank you, Jacob, for a fantastic presentation. I'm learning so much. I come from a background of the arts, particularly in music. I'm a singer.
Oh.
I'm also in business aviation, so I'm very much interested in how this concept could apply to private jets. So my question would be, have you, firstly, does it already exist in the business aviation and private jets to start? Because you mentioned earlier commercial cabins. So
Yeah, commercial tend to have much longer development cycles, and they're not quite there. The business jet domain is starting to implement these technologies, and they're also targeting a slightly different clientele. And so they can maybe afford to invest a couple more dollars in the experience. And without revealing too much about what's happening there, I can say that we are engaged with them, and they're using technologies to replicate the in-cabin experience so that when people come and they want to try out certain private jet layouts and packages, there is an acoustic component that's being presented to the potential buyers so that they can not only get to feel the leather seats and touch the mahogany, they also get to hear what it would be like once they're up flying.
thank you.
So Jacob, this is Ed Story. I'm involved with eVTOL companies to a degree.
Yep.
And my question is, in your experience, are all the major eVTOL companies focusing the same amount on ASD and or ANC issues? In other words, one or two companies looking into this, or are all the top end companies more or less equally involved in this?
My experience is that it's not equal. A good question, Ed. My experience is that it's not equal because the number one thing that these guys are trying to adhere to is the noise exposure on the rest of the soundscape. So I think there are regulations for how much noise these crafts can make at takeoff at certain distances, and the noise requirements escape me, but I think it's 100 feet away during takeoff, and then likewise when they're hovering at 1,500 feet, there are other noise requirements. Those are the number one and number two issues that they're battling, and that is not something that ASD or ANC can do anything about because that's out in the exterior and that's uncontrolled. So that goes back to the design phase, the mechanical engineering exercises that they are all spending a lot of dollars on getting right, because otherwise I believe they don't get the flight worthiness certification from the FAA if they can't meet those requirements. But then you get into a little bit more of the luxury end of the in-cabin experience, and there you start to see some separation in the tiers of companies that are investing a little bit more.
Well, thank you for that. And I would just add that I support, or a whole number of us pilots support, a lot of the smaller airports in the greater Los Angeles area. And we're very, very concerned about noise, as well as pollution and safety and so forth. But noise is the issue at hand. And your response is helpful in terms of the outside effect. And certainly the inside effect will affect the customer acceptance of these machines. But the outside effect is the one that oftentimes has the greatest political effect in terms of the maintenance of a particular airport, one or more, of which there are many in the greater Los Angeles area. Anyway, thank you very much for your comments.
Yeah, you're welcome, man. In my former life, when I worked at Gross Sound and Vibration, we did have systems that were used for airport monitoring that would help the local governments figure out exactly how many planes were allowed to land per 24-hour period, day-night levels, basically. Because if you had certain planes that were more noisy, they would end up breaking the whatever the limit was at the time, and that had to be measured and regulated. And again, I remember there were microphones spaced, you know, miles before the airport and after, and et cetera. So that is the number one thing that's right now driving noise and sound in aircraft.
Well, when push comes to shove, and I don't want to get too far off track here, but when push comes to shove, anybody in the air can land on an airport. That's what the FAA requires. Okay. The question is whether the runway length is sufficient to be safe to land. But much as the political folks and the people that live in a particular area might like to, add microphones or have some sort of noise effect there, in terms of political action, it's very difficult for them other than simply closing the airport. And it's sort of a black or white question that we end up with. And so enough of that, though. But thank you for your commentaries.
Thank you.
Okay, of course, this is primarily a matter of occupant ability to enjoy the flight. Now, does Nathaniel have a question?
Yeah, actually, hi Jacob. I was wondering what you thought about the application of active noise control, or in this case, active sound design, towards smaller scale eVTOLs. So falling under that 55-pound maximum from the FAA, the more towards eVTOLs for like package delivery, as opposed to human transport. I was wondering if you thought they would active noise control is applicable in this sense, and to what extent, because the weight trade-off is pretty bad there.
Yeah, that's even more critical than with the weight requirement, because they are so lightweight. So for active noise cancellation, that's something that would be implemented on the listener perspective, and so there's not much you can do about that from a small drone, like delivery type drone that you're alluding to, because it's going to be out in the public. So there's nothing you can do there. In terms of actively modulating the sounds, that is an interesting concept. Goes a little bit back to what my colleague Brian mentioned about, using active design in motorcycle exhaust. There are things you can do, but you have to do it very delicately, because you are essentially adding noise. And while you do want the thing to be quiet, you also want it to sound more pleasing. And not always does adding more noise make it be perceptually louder, because you can mask or remove certain grading elements of the sound. So it's a delicate thing, but it's possible. But then you get down into the ROI of something like a delivery drone that, does it really matter if it sounds great or not, as long as it's quiet enough to go and deliver its package and then get out of there? There's no real occupant to appreciate whether it sounds nice or not. So unfortunately, that's one of those that's really down low on the totem pole. But it's a good question, and it's possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Okay, was Ron asking a question?
No. I was hoping he was asking.
Oh, okay. Okay. One thing I may have missed is are your sensors co-located with the speaker system in the headset, or are you trying to do speakers, or trying to infer those from other locations around the cabin?
They can be. Just to be clear, we don't deliver the speakers or the microphones that would be used in systems like this. So I can't really comment on those as much. But they can be. The thing that you have to be careful of is if you place a microphone right next to a speaker, you're going to get quite a significant sort of feedback loop and echo path that you have to be mindful of. And there are things you can do like echo cancellation, like you would know from normal telecommunication systems. So for instance, right now when I'm speaking to you guys in the room in the library, my voice is booming into the room and it's coming through that microphone and right back to me, except there's a noise cancel or an echo cancellation system in place that is able to cancel out my own voice so I don't hear myself. Thank goodness I don't have to hear myself as I'm talking. Exactly the same concept would take place in systems like this, but you just want to avoid too much of acoustic as well as structural feedback. So if something is moving like a speaker diaphragm, you don't want the microphone too close to that because that movement could also start oscillating the microphone and induce signals that way. That's a little harder to cancel, but the principle of echo cancellation is fairly well known and people use it. They have to use it.
I was inferring that you were actually providing both the sensor and the analysis and the feedback system. Was that not the case?
Only for the test and measurement of the system that's being developed. So we have sensors in terms of microphones and head and torso simulators, but we don't make the products that go into the craft itself. We're purely on the test and measurement side. So we're on the evaluation side and the analysis side. But our expertise helps govern and direct the design of it.
Well, I think that's a very informative and interesting presentation. Oh, we have another possible question here.
Yeah, Scott.
Oh, from Scott. Scott, you're back again. Let's go ahead and do that. If we have the time to carry on.
I didn't really need to. I was just responding to a reply in the chat. No, the comment about masking mechanical transients and whatnot. I understand, the classic noise cancellation a la Bose or whatever, is just masking tonal type things. It's not intended to mask a gunshot, and it'll be time delayed, so you'll get an echo, is what you'll end up getting. But the issue is that when you start masking conversations or localizing conversations to one zone of the aircraft, I'm just saying it may have unintended consequences in that there'll be another point in the aircraft where the sound is doubled or it screeches or it feedbacks on itself or something, which may be interpreted as a problem with the aircraft or masks a problem with the aircraft. So again, I wasn't intending to start a conversation with the group, but that's what the point of my comment was. Over.
Was that something you can respond to or not, Jacob? So
not necessary. It's just food for thought. People need to think about unintended consequences. That was my only point in the whole conversation. Over.
My comment is point well taken.
Okay.
Agreed.
Okay, well, we've gone slightly over the 1 hour scheduled time for this, but I think with very good content. And I really appreciate your providing this information, and look forward to seeing these systems in real life.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate you guys having me, and maybe in a little bit I could come back and give an update on some of these developments that are happening in the industry.
That would be great. Okay. Oh, Layla would like to.
Hello again. If I may add, Jacob, you sound good, right, everybody? Jacob sounds good. Your voice sounds really nice, so no worries about it. And I'm new to the group, and I wanted to thank everyone for having me here. Ken, Thanks for all the commentaries. This has been a very valuable presentation. So I enjoyed it very much and looking forward to the next one. Meanwhile, have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and sign off. And thank you. We'll stop the recording, and we'll look forward to
The next one.
the next one.
Yeah.
Yes.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Jake.